Okay, this is Malachi Bishop at the Rehabilitation Counseling Program at the University of Kentucky, and this is RC-650, Rehabilitation Counseling Techniques and Interventions and Theories. We're talking about theories today, and we're going to talk about Adlerian theory today. And Alfred Adler famously said, "The chief danger in life is that you may take too many precautions." And I think that is in some respects symbolic of his approach to counseling. We'll be talking a little bit more about that. I wanted to begin this session by going back just a bit, because I think when I was covering Freud, I had mentioned some recent research that I was going to tell you about that I forgot to mention. So I'm going to go back for a minute. And if we remember talking about psychoanalysis, key ideas there, or the important things that you need to remember about psychoanalysis, the key ideas. And basically they are that there are forces that are outside of our awareness because they are subconscious, that we attribute a lot of control to. In other words, we are not entirely responsible for our actions, because these forces that are subconscious, the id and the superego, below the level of consciousness, impact our behavior and our thinking in the conscious world. The idea that these parts of our personality are in conflict, but that this is a system, and there are energy forces at work operating in a system, and when one is strong, then the other one or two of the others has to respond to overcome. So, for example, when the id is sending strong urges to do something, the ego has to respond with energy, and so if the id is winning, then basically you might think of it as the superego is as less energy, for example. So this idea of a transfer of energy, and the research that I had recently heard about was some research done in social psychology, and I believe it was in the lab of Baumeister, was doing this work. And what they did was they brought people in for these experiments, and I'm going to tell you the short story, not all the details, but the sort of basic picture was that they would bring these subjects in to do a research study, and there would be some brownies or cookies on the table, and they would tell the people, we don't want you to touch these brownies, these cookies. They smell delicious, and they were just fresh out of the oven. And so the people had to sit there, and the experimenter would leave the room, and the people would be asked not to help themselves. And that's part of the study. The other part of the study is that they would ask the subjects to participate in some cognitive tasks that required them to use their mental energy. So work out some sorts of problems, for example. And then there would be other subjects who were not asked to do any of this sort of work, and were just asked to basically sit in the room. So they had the two conditions, and what they found, and again, this is an overview. I'm leaving out some of the important details, but basically what they found is that the subject's ability to withstand the temptation to reach for the brownie or the cookie and help themselves went down as their cognitive or mental energy was depleted. So they the subjects who had worked hard and were tired were more likely to help themselves to the brownies and cookies. What's this got to do with Freud and psychoanalysis? Well, a thought is that that it's related to this idea of energy transfer below the surface. We're not aware of this necessarily going on, but when we use up some of our mental energy in another task, we may have less energy to control our willpower, for example. And this is something we can relate to any of us who have tried to lose weight, for example. When are we most likely to break our diet, to go into the kitchen and help ourselves to a bowl of ice cream or some cookies or some chips? I think most people would say we're more likely to do that in the evening, at the end of a day, when we are more tired, cognitively, mentally tired. We're less able to use our willpower. It's a lot easier to diet earlier in the day. And so one idea that you might take from this research is that at some level there is support for some of Freud's hypotheses, that energy below or outside of our conscious awareness, there is some sort of energy transfer going on. All right, so that was the research I wanted to tell you about. Now I want to talk about Alfred Adler and Adlerian theory. And as before, we're going to start by talking a little bit about Adler the person. And Alfred Adler and Sigmund Freud, actually there are a number of relationships and interesting sort of shared experiences between these two. They did, of course, work together at one point in their life, but they also eventually worked apart, and we'll get to that in a minute. But there's a lot of crossover in the lives of these two men who lived in roughly the same period of time. Adler was born in 1870 and in Vienna, so another Viennese physician. He was born in a middle-class Jewish family, not another family that didn't live in a Jewish neighborhood, didn't strongly associate with the Jewish religion, and Adler himself never strongly identified as a Jew. Interestingly, he converted to Protestantism when he was an adolescent and considered himself for the rest of his life a Christian. Why is this significant? I think, again, thinking about the life of the individual and thinking about the theory, this represents a fairly significant change in an individual's life made in adolescence. Pretty big change to be making pretty early in your life, and I think it speaks in a sense to that idea of courage and having the courage to make significant change in your life, not taking too many precautions. He was the second of 6 children, and he had an older brother whose name, by the way, was Sigmund. And Adler always sort of felt in the shadow of his brother. He always felt like he was living in the shadow of the older brother, Sigmund. Adler himself was a sickly child. He had rickets when he was an infant, and when he was about 5 years old, he had a very severe case of pneumonia, and he actually heard the family doctor tell his father that he would probably not live. So a 5-year-old hearing the doctor tell the parent that the child would probably die of pneumonia. Pretty significant event. And how did Adler respond? He recovered, and about that point in his life, he decided to become a physician. So this idea of overcoming and, in a very specific way, overcoming and committing himself to helping others who would eventually deal with this problem. So he wanted to become a physician to help others who were in the same situation. Made that decision at a very young age. Adler favored his father, who was described as a social, gregarious, outgoing sort of fella. Described his mother as nervous and gloomy, and this relationship that Adler had with his parents very different from the one we talked about with Freud and his very close relationship with his mother. The favored son in the family, very close relationship with his mother, and it is said that Adler's relationship with his parents made the idea of the Oedipus complex, this idea of wishing that the father would disappear so that the son can fill the role and take over that the relationship with the mother. That really didn't make any sense to Adler. That was always a very foreign idea. We didn't go too much into the Oedipal complex when we talked about Freud, and I'm expecting that you would read about that. But as I said when we talked about Freud, that was the psychosexual stages, that whole discussion really one of the least important in terms of our applying psychoanalysis to rehabilitation counseling, in my opinion. Still an important idea that I do expect you would read about in your textbook. Going back to Adler, very close relationship with his father, as I said. Adler was a very poor student in grade school. He wasn't doing too well, poor to average at best, and his teacher one time told his father to take him out of school and apprentice him to a cobbler. So basically he said to Adler's dad, he said, this kid isn't going to make it, you should get him into work he can do, so get him into an apprenticeship as a shoemaker. His father responded by telling Adler and basically laughing at the teacher and say, hear what this guy thinks about you and your potential. Let's show him that he's wrong. Let's overcome this challenge, and Adler did become a much better student after that. So again, this idea of overcoming. He received his MD at the age of 25, as Freud did. So they both finished med school at the age of 25. Freud became a neurologist. Adler was a general practitioner initially. So he worked with general practice and actually worked with some of the poorest patients in the area, in Vienna. But he developed through this work as a physician, he started to develop this idea of overcoming physical challenges. He saw that in his patients. He saw them overcoming the illnesses, the conditions that they had, and that idea of overcoming, we'll talk about later as one of the key ideas in his theory. In 1899, we talked about this idea of Freud publishing a book on dream analysis. Now, when that book came out in 1899, it was actually received as a joke. It was pretty much scoffed at by those who read it, and the ideas in there were fairly out there at the time, and it wasn't received well. But Adler read the book and was impressed with the ideas and actually wrote a defense of the book. And Freud was impressed with the defense, and they started writing to each other back and forth and developed a relationship. And in 1902, Adler joined Freud in his Wednesday evening discussion circle. So the two started working together in the area of psychoanalysis, this famous Wednesday evening group of psychoanalysts, and Adler eventually became president of the Psychoanalytic Society. But between 1902 and 1911, when Adler left and took several others with him over really divergent views about therapy and people and the right way to work with people, a lot of different ideas developed between the two over the years. Adler left in 1911 and took several people with him. So there's a significant rift between the two, and they never really overcame it. It lasted until the ends of their respective lives. But Adler left and formed the new school of psychology, which he called individual psychology. We're just going to refer to as Adlerian theory. Adler did not write as much as Freud. Freud was quite prolific in his writing. Adler was more of a speaker, and he was quite an active lecturer and speaker. Traveled quite a bit in his later years, giving lectures, including in the States. But he died in 1967 while he was on a lecture tour in Scotland in 1933. So that's a brief overview of the life of Alfred Adler. He was a couple other things I might mention. He started he established a series of mental health clinics in the public schools in Vienna in the 20s and early 30s. And these were very successful, and the model that he used is still used today around the world. And basically what he did is he would bring families together and children who were having trouble in their lives or in their families, and a lot of professionals would come together, the families, and these clinics would be held, and he would work with the family in sort of a large group setting. And these clinics turned out to be very effective in reducing the rate of juvenile delinquency in Vienna. Very successful, but they were closed down in 1934 by the Nazis. He served as an army medic in World War I. And another thing you need to know about Alfred Adler was that he was very sociable, very outgoing, very personable guy, and he spent a lot of time his time in the cafe scene in Vienna, which sort of what people did to socialize. A lot of cafes, and he spent a lot of time working and seeing people, and just the way he was. He was a people person, very sociable, very different from Freud, who was much more of an introvert. So another difference between the two. Okay, moving on to the theory. A couple of nice quotes there I like from Adler. I like this one too. I think it sort of represents his theory of life. What do you do first when you learn to swim? You make mistakes. And what happens? You make other mistakes. And when you have made all the mistakes you possibly can without drowning, and some of them many times over, what do you find? You find that you can swim. And life is just the same as learning to swim. You have to make mistakes. You make mistakes over and over. Don't be afraid of making mistakes, but there's no other way of learning how to live. So we're going to talk about some key concepts in Adlerian theory. His view of the person, his ideas about behavior having social meaning and being purposeful. We're going to talk about this idea of the unity and pattern of personality, the idea that behavior is subjective, and this idea of lifestyle, which I like to think of as personality. Where does that come from, and what does that mean? Quickly, I wanted to do a comparison of Freud and Adler. Again, I'm expecting that you've done your reading in the text of this chapter, so you have some ideas about these differences. But basically, Freud and Adler, very different perspectives about a few important things in terms of their theories. Freud is described as, and this is an important term for you to become aware of, determinism. All right, the idea that behavior is determined by forces. In this case, forces that are unconscious and instinctual, and so out of our awareness, but we are determined by forces outside of our control. When we talk about behavior therapy and behavior theory, we'll talk about determinism, again, a different kind of determinism. But in terms of psychoanalysis, we're talking about behavior being determined by forces outside of our conscious awareness. Humanism, which we consider Adler's theory and some of the other theories we'll be talking about this semester, are humanistic theories. Carl Rogers, Gestalt, for example, would be humanistic theories. People have the power within the limits of environment and biology to control their own behaviors, to interpret, influence, and create events. So rather than being determined, we have the power to determine our own lives to a great extent. There are some limits on that. We can't do anything we want, but we do have the power to choose our own behavior. Psychoanalysis is very much based on the perspective of the analyst, and what is happening with the client is to a great extent based on the interpretation of the psychoanalyst. In the Adlerian and humanistic perspectives, we attempt to see the world through the eyes of the client, from the perspective of the client, and this is referred to as phenomenological perspective, through the eyes of the person we're working with, through the eyes of the client. So less of a medical model where the physician is in charge, more the more consumer model, really, the idea that the patient or client is in charge, and we need to understand their perspective. In psychoanalysis, the motivations for our behavior are sexual and aggressive instincts. And in the Adlerian perspective, our motivation is primarily social. And we'll be talking more about that. So moving on to the key ideas. First one is Adler's view of the person. And Adler, as I said, sees people as responsible and in control and able to choose their behavior. We make decisions consciously. We see people as creative, capable problem solvers and decision makers, not determined by their childhood, as in the Freudian psychoanalysis and the impact of those early psychosexual experiences. Certainly childhood is important in Adlerian theory, and the early experiences are important, but they are less determining than in the psychoanalytic perspective. So we refer to that in Adlerian theory as a soft determinism. They affect us, but they do not determine us. We make choices. Again, our choices are not unlimited. All right. So given the limits that we have, which are you might choose to say that you want to play in the NBA, but your parents were both 5 feet tall, and your heredity has made you a person who's 5 feet tall. It makes it very unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely that you're going to play in the NBA or the WNBA. But within those sorts of limitations of heredity and environment, disability-related limitations, whatever those might be, within the hand that was dealt us, we have the ability to use what is given to make choices about how we're going to use that. So there are some limits, but we do also have the power to choose our courses. So much more, I think, optimistic view of people and their ability to maneuver through life than we saw with the last theory. Second key idea is that all behavior has social meaning. And what does this mean? The idea here is that we are born into a world where we need to learn to engage people in ways that are effective for us in order to survive. Okay, we need to from the day we are born, we need our parents to respond to us positively in order to survive. As we get older, in order to get the things we need and the things we want, it helps if we get along with people. So it becomes less necessarily a survival thing, but more a thriving and getting the things that we want depends on our ability to cooperate with people and to have relationships with people. So social relationships are the key driver, the key motivation in this theory. All behavior takes place in a social system and can only be understood in terms of relationships. How does Adler then define mental health? Because behavior takes place in a social environment, the idea of social interest, which is a important theory and important aspect of Adlerian theory, this idea of social interest, is basically how mental health is defined. People are mentally healthy to the extent that they have social interest. And what is social interest? It is this ability to share with and live with and care about others on this crust of earth. So it's not just the ability to get along with the people right around us, but it's really a bigger idea. Understanding that in order to survive as individuals and to survive as humans, we share responsibility for our fellow humans, for the environment, and for ecology. So it's really a more global perspective. You care about people, you care about the environment and ecology. And Adler said it's the individual, it's the person who is not interested in his fellow man who has the greatest difficulties in life and who provides the greatest injury to others. Third key idea, all behavior is purposeful and goal-oriented. We act, we behave, including emotions. Emotions are a behavior in this, from this perspective. What we think is behavior, and all behavior, including emotion, cognition, and what you can actually see a person doing, that sort of behavior, is performed with a purpose, and the purpose is we are working toward some goal. What we do is done in order to achieve some purpose. And when I think of this in terms of therapy, I think that this is a good way of understanding this. You meet a client for the first time, and you have some strong reaction to the client. How do you feel in response to this client and their behavior? And I said, for example, you have a very strong response. You really don't like this person. You wish that they hadn't come in. You feel like you want to not work with this person. Okay, that response, to a great extent, is probably a response to the behavior of the client. And what does that tell us as counselors? It tells us from this perspective that this person's goal is maybe to be left alone. And so the way that they behave in the world is by behaving in such a way that people do leave them alone. And so they get what they want. They achieve their goal. Their behavior is purposeful. If, on the other hand, let's say you meet with a client and you at the end of the first session, you want to do things for this client. You want to help this client. You want to do all you can to help this client you have that sort of response. You want to make phone calls for them. You want to talk to people for them. You're motivated to help them. Again, this is a response to the behavior of the client, and what it gets this client is people probably help this client, maybe do things for this client because of that behavior that they are using. Okay? So that's the idea. All behavior is purposeful and goal-oriented, and as counselors, we can use this idea. We can understand our clients' behavior by asking ourselves, how do they make us feel? And what does this behavior probably get them out in the world? What are their goals? The general overriding goal of human behavior is defined in this theory as superiority. Okay, but this is a concept I want to define very clearly, because the goal is, it's called superiority, and you've heard of the inferiority complex. One of the more famous Adlerian ideas, but really one of the least useful in terms of what we're talking about. But the opposite of that is superiority. But the goal is not superiority over others. Okay, that's an important idea to understand. The goal is superiority over ourselves. So I like to think of it more in terms of these other ideas of completion, becoming a better person, mastering ourselves, self-realization, and basically to become better people, to improve and grow and to become more like the person that we want to become. So superiority means becoming the ideal self, or working toward that ideal self and becoming better than we are. The general goal is to achieve significance, and I think it's fairly safe to say that everybody wants to be significant. Everybody wants to feel like they make a difference, like they are important. What is different, what is unique, if this is the general goal, is the way that people define significance. Some people see their chance to be significant in the world by being good and kind. Some people see it as being the best mother or father that they can be. Some people see it as becoming the President of the United States. Some people see it as being the worst criminal in the history of the United States. We all define what is significant differently. How are we going to become significant? We all define that differently. But the general idea is that everybody you meet wants to feel important, significant, like their life has meaning and like their life has made a difference. All behavior, all action we take are at some level directed toward this goal. And this idea of fictional finality is that sort of picture that isn't necessarily a really clear picture, but this sort of general idea of where we see ourselves heading. This ideal person, this where we want to be at the end of our lives. Fictional because it is not, we haven't got there yet. We're always working toward it, and it's probably not realistic. We tend to view the future, our future, optimistically. But it is fictional finality. It is that end point that we are all striving toward. Fourth key idea is this idea of the unity and patterns of personality. And the idea here is that basically we are consistent. People are consistent. We tend to operate in a consistent manner toward our goals. We tend to, if you watch people, if you observe people, if you know people long enough, you tend to start to see patterns in relationships, in goal achievement. People who, you may know people, for example, who tend to have a certain kind of relationship, however you might characterize that. Very explosive relationships, very positive relationships, for example. People tend to continue to use the same behavioral patterns throughout their lives, unless the behavior consistently causes them problems, and they are able to change the behavior usually through theory or some significant life change. But otherwise, people tend to consistently act the same ways over time. So by watching the behaviors of a client, we can get a sense of two things. We can get a sense of their goal. We talked about that. How do they make you feel? Or looking back over their lives, talking to them about their lives, you get a sense of what is important, what they are moving toward, how they see themselves in the future. And you also see the attitudes and beliefs and movement associated with that. And again, if you get to know clients, the longer you know them, you more likely you are going to see these patterns start to develop. They may not be immediately obvious, but because the Adlerians believe that there is this idea of unity of patterns and consistency, eventually patterns will emerge. Key idea number 5, behavior is subjectively determined. Okay, the idea here, two people two people do anything. Two people are in a car crash. Two people are standing right next to each other, watch a car crash. Two people trip down the stairs. Two people who are even identical twins both develop a spinal cord injury. Okay, what we know, what we've learned over time in the area of adjustment to disability, for example, is that no matter how similar people seem, everybody views objective events in a different way. So the two people watching the car crash, when you talk to them, you'll hear two sometimes slightly, sometimes very different stories. Two people who are identical twins whose lives on paper look very similar in every respect, experience a spinal cord injury at the same level, will experience the event differently and will adjust and respond to the event very differently. The idea is that behavior is subjective. Our responses are subjective because we create meaning. We experience the same thing as other people, but we put our own meaning to it, on it. We interpret it our own way. So it's not the events in our lives that are important, but the perception and interpretation of the event that determines our response. Okay? Very important idea, and like a lot of Adler's ideas, it's an idea that other theorists sort of took and ran with, and it's an idea that we'll talk more about, and you'll see again in later theories that we talk about.